Good evening, everyone. And welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm Janine Pollock, Chief of Special Collections here at the Free Library. This feels like Groundhog's Day. This is my same remarks from last year, sort of. But before we proceed further, I'd like to acknowledge that the Free Library is in Lenapehoking, the original territory of the Lenape peoples. The Lenape Nation's rightful relationship with their ancestral homeland continues, both for those who were forcefully displaced and for those who remain here today. As the effects of colonization are ongoing, institutions like the Free Library have a responsibility to take actions that support healing, reconciliation, and Indigenous futures, which we are sincerely committed to doing through growing partnerships and programming. Tonight, we are here to celebrate the opening of the image of the book representing the Codex from Antiquity to the Present, the 16th annual Lawrence J. Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age. We are happy to have you here both in person and over Zoom. The Free Library has been a partner in this event, as well as many other initiatives throughout the years with Penn. We welcome researchers from undergraduate students to the most seasoned scholars who deepen our understanding of our collections with their discoveries. Penn Library's OPEN database provides access to thousands of our manuscripts, and this past year we hosted the annual meeting for Digital Scriptorium, which is thriving under the leadership of Lynn Ransom and generous resourcing from Penn and its member institutions. Most recently, Emily Steiner and her students have undertaken a project to transcribe our 16-foot-long Lewis E. 201 genealogy roll, a project generously supported by the Richard III Society. We look forward to continued collaboration in making all of our manuscripts with Penn Library, available, and continuing collaborations with the Penn Libraries and the Kislak Center. I want to acknowledge my gratitude to the staff of the Free Library's Rare Book Department, who not only have hosted you so graciously tonight, but who welcome so many of you into our reading room. And now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Sean Quimby, Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts, a Penn Library's director. Please join me in welcoming Sean.
Thank you, Janine. I'm going to raise the microphone a little bit as I'm being followed by two people taller than I am. So thank you, Janine, and thank you to the Free Library for hosting us this evening. I will echo her welcome to the 16th annual Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age. As Janine said, I'm the Associate University Librarian for Special Collections and Director of the Kislak Center. The 16th Annual Symposium falls in the 10th year of the Schoenberg Institute's existence, which in turn came 17 years after the Schoenberg Center for Electronic Text and Image, or SETI, was established at Penn. For those of you who may have a hard time, especially this late in the day, keeping up with the math, that year was 1996. My intent is not to tie your brain into some kind of knot, but to say that Larry Schoenberg's vision has propelled the Penn Libraries for a generation now. In a 1988 New York Times article about his ambitions for AGS Computers, the company that he had co-founded, Larry said, "When you first set the goal, you don't worry about it, but then you have to start making good on it." And the same could be said for SIMS, which since its founding has pursued the very simply stated mission of bringing manuscripts, technology, and people together. So 10 years into the Institute's existence, we continue to leverage new developments in technology in the effort to better understand pre-modern manuscript cultures, reimagining digital scriptorium, building new platforms like Basira, which you're going to hear a lot about over the next couple of days, and which serves as the inspiration for tonight's, for this year's symposium. as well as offering programs like the online Coffee with a Codex and publishing a journal dedicated to bridging gaps and tearing down walls between changing technology and scholarly research on manuscripts. We are, I can say with some confidence, making good on it. And we're making good on it thanks to the generosity of Larry and Barbara, and thanks to the talented team here at Penn that includes Lynn Ransom, our curator of programs, Nick Herman, Larry Schoenberg, curator of manuscripts, Dot Porter, our curator of digital research services, and many, many others. Their subject expertise and technical savvy are the base elements that make the alchemy of SIMS work. So let me thank them and the many other people around the world who are working day in and day out to make good on Larry's vision. And with that, why don't we get started? I'm going to turn the podium over to the aforementioned Nick Herman, who will introduce our symposium's keynote speaker. Thank you.
So it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for the 16th annual Lawrence J. Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age, Jeffrey Hamburger. Professor Hamburger is the Kuno Francke Professor of German Art and Culture in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. Throughout an extraordinary career that continues and indeed accelerates, Professor Hamburger has, perhaps more than any other scholar today, contributed to our knowledge and understanding of the visual culture of the later European Middle Ages in all its rich variety. Beginning with the now classic monographs, the Rothschild Canticles, Nuns as Artists, and the Visual and the Visionary, Hamburger launched the study of the hand-decorated book, not merely as a conveyor of style, artistry, or national character, but rather as an artifact of a community of practice. Throughout his innumerable publications, a common thread is the ability of the manuscript page to encode complex thought about through the interplay of images, diagrams, and inscriptions. Through many a patient, erudite exposition of overlooked iconographies, he's taught us that illuminations exist not merely as a crutch for the unlettered or as a simple complement to dense theological texts, but rather that they have the power to convey ideas not otherwise communicable through oral or textual means. Indeed, his most recent work has delved into the realm of acrostics, of color theory, and of the diagrammatic, witnessed especially by Diagramming Devotion from 2020, Color in Cusanus from 2021, and an important volume co-edited with Linda Safran and David Roxborough, The Diagram as Paradigm, published just last year. This volume, in fact, served as a veritable textbook for a course I had the pleasure of co-teaching last semester with our colleague, Professor Ellie Truitt, and which employed the diagram-laden codices of the Schoenberg collection at Penn as its central focus. Professor Hamburger's leading position in the field is witnessed by a string of academic prizes and honors, by his membership in the American Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and as a fellow of the Medieval Academy of America. He's also been instrumental in a number of groundbreaking collaborative exhibitions, including in 2005, Crown and Veil, an exploration of the art of female monasticism in Germany, and more recently, Beyond Words, illuminated manuscripts from Boston Collections from 2016, and finally, Imperial Splendor, the art of the book in the Holy Roman Empire, which was held at the Morgan Library in New York 2 years ago. This was the first comprehensive exhibition dedicated to German manuscript illumination to be held in this hemisphere. Like much of Hamburger's work, it shed light on a true treasure trove of material from east of the Rhine and north of the Alps, so often ignored, at least in English language scholarship, in favor of British, Flemish, French, and Italian visual production. But tonight, we hear from Professor Hamburger on a specific and recurrent subtopic in his work, namely how visual configurations within the book can emphasize its status as a talisman of authority. The theme comes to the fore in his wide-ranging monographic essay on page openings, still one of the few interventions on this nevertheless central topic. And from 2021, another monograph, The Birth of the Author, Pictorial Prefaces in Glossed Books of the 12th Century, which explores how introductory images from the Romanesque period could make claims about authorship that outstripped those made in the text. Tonight, through an exploration of avatars of authority, he will delve into yet another means by which images can work to underline and reinforce the authority of the book. Mr. Hamburger. Yeah.
Sorry, with apologies to Deborah, I'm going to delete her. There we go. Okay, well, first of all, Nick, thanks for that very warm and generous introduction. I also want to apologize for taking you away from what was a very nice party downstairs. I gladly would have stayed. I hope that I won't try your patience. This talk is about an hour long, and so I hope you'll bear with me. I also wanted to say that I'm still tickled pink to see you all again. After far too long a time, that sort of post-COVID glow hasn't worn off yet. I see many old friends in the audience whom I haven't seen for 5 or 6 years. So it really is wonderful, and I'm very grateful for this occasion. In Sanskrit, the term avatar means descent. In Hinduism, it refers more specifically to the material manifestation of a deity or spirit in this life. Medieval art is full of such manifestations. Indeed, Christianity is predicated on the possibility. Following Christ's ascension into heaven, Christian avatars became a necessity. Not only did they provide proof of Christ's incarnation, his body having been assumed along with that of the Virgin Mary into heaven, they also confirmed his promise that in due course all bodies would rise from the dead to be reunited with their souls at the last judgment. In the fullness of time, everyone would be an avatar. In medieval Christianity, avatars appear everywhere, whether in the form of visions and visitations, relics, and not least works of art. To judge from medieval textual witnesses, none of which can be taken objectively as they always serve some polemical purpose, not only did images inspire visions or other forms of contact with the divine, they themselves, as in the case of images not made by human hands, miraculous images, made divinity present and palpable in the world. Christianity is not only a matter of vision, but also of touch. Indeed, vision, whether framed in terms of extramission or intramission, could be conceptualized in terms of contact. The laying on of hands extends from persons to things, with miraculous matter serving as a conduit, corporeal as well as celestial. Of this phenomenon, contact relics offer a primary example. A manuscript did not have to be considered a relic to raise comparable issues of fidelity. Replication and transmission only heightened concerns about authenticity. The Codex, a medium whose emergence is coeval with that of Christianity, if not its consequence, participated in the logic of the avatar. Books lent saving words material form, and in the case of the Gospels, embodiment, an effect enhanced by the materiality of treasure bindings, especially those with figural adornment. Effects of embodiment were hardly limited to the exterior of codices, however. Written on parchment, chapter and verse took on flesh in the parlance of John's mantra, and the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The task of the medieval illuminator before, with the advent of scholasticism, books became disembodied texts, was to lend presence to the author as if he were speaking directly to the reader, to make of a mere transcription a material manifestation of authenticity and authority, both terms intrinsically linked to that of authorship. Figuration, whether in the form of initials or miniatures, did not simply illustrate the text. They gave it a voice, and by extension, a speaking body. All of this bears repeating when considering the emergence and development of representations of authorship in medieval manuscripts. Like modern frontispieces, these images both identified the text and offered an interpretation of its contents. Their primary function, however, was to assure the reader that the words on the page were authentic and that they accurately represented the author's train of thought, as if the author were speaking to the reader face to face. Speaking came before writing, and not just according to the Christian order of things. Attested since Plato, suspicion of the written word also found precedent in rhetorical tradition and practice. According to this view, speech made sense. In contrast, writing stood at a remove from its source. The unmediated character of the spoken word, however, is illusory as any supposed immediacy of the image. Neither is natural. Nonetheless, as noted long ago by Walter Ong, and I quote, "After the invention of script, the central verbal activity to which systematic attention was at first given was the art of public speaking, not the art of written composition. Scribes learned how to commit discourse to writing, but basically composition as such remained an oral matter. From antiquity through the Renaissance into the beginnings of Romanticism, under all teaching about the art of verbal expression, there lies the more or less dominant supposition that the paradigm of all expression is the oration." A copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy offers an example of how such conceptions manifest themselves in images. Despite his being chained by the neck, Boethius's body language speaks volumes. Shunning the muses of poetry, whose blaring trumpets make distracting noise, he shields his eyes, dimmed, as he says, with much weeping, from the vision of Lady Philosophy, of whom he says, her stature was difficult to judge. At one moment, it exceeded not the common height. At another, her forehead seemed to strike the sky. And whenever she raised her head higher, she began to pierce within the very heavens and to baffle the eyes of them that looked upon her. Vision gives way to hearing so that truth can proceed from the mouth of Lady Philosophy, whose antenna-like scepter transgresses the frame to reach the heavens, to the receptive ear of the author, whence it is incarnated in a book, not only the volume Boethius holds, but also that which the reader holds in his hands. Philosophy's extended index finger points to an open window in the spandrel of the frame, within a frame, representing the prison in which Boethius is housed, an opening that mirrors that of the codex he proffers to the reader. From outside the frame to within it, and from disembodied voice to embodied book, the passage from idea to speech to writing could not be more clearly delineated. Even if a work had not been dictated to an amanuensis, author portraits foster the illusion that speaking precedes writing, and therefore is both more authoritative and efficacious. In this logocentric construction, the spoken word, akin to the divine fiat, embodies authenticity. It comes, as it were, straight from the horse's mouth, without the vagaries that come into play with transmission across time or via other media. The ordinary experience of transcription errors would have made medieval readers wary of written testimony. The problem is as elemental as the four Gospels, multiple witnesses to a single truth. Canon tables and gospel harmonies represented two ways of reconciling their varying testimony. Pictures were another. In the Gospels of Saint Pierre des Fossés, the four evangelists fill an opening that links the multiplicity represented by the canon tables that precede it to a solitary cross that follows, in which the four become one. Despite precedent provided by evangelist portraits, other representations of co-authorship remain rather infrequent. A 12th century historical compendium from Verona offers a signal example, telling in its asynchronicity. 5 figures from 3 different time periods fill an entire page. Constantine, 4th century, commands the Greek historians Theodoret, Zosimene, and Socrates Scholasticus, 5th century, to compose their works of church history, which Cassiodorus, 6th century, sequestered within an architectural frame to the right, compiles into his Historia Ecclesiastica Tripartita. The image draws together the testimony of 4 non-contemporaneous authors in the figure of Constantine, who presides over the scene much like a Christ in majesty and invests a piecemeal process of transmission with ultimate authority. Pictures could also collapse time and space by making authors present. In a glossed Pauline epistles, a drawing of the apostle cleverly links the conclusion of the prologue to Romans to the beginning of the epistle proper. Emerging from a space that the scribe left free on purpose, suggesting perhaps that scribe and artist were one, the hand of God, identified with Christ by the cross behind it, blesses the author, thereby approving this instantiation of the text, which is of one piece with his body, which represents his corpus in both senses of the word. Pictures could also lend the manuscript in the reader's hands the illusion it was the author's autograph. In a northern French copy of Augustine's De Trinitate, the first word, lecturus, opens the statement, the following reading concerning the Trinity. By embedding the author within his text, writing and reading become one. It is as if we, the reader, looking over the saint's shoulder, watch his text come into being as we mouth the words. Any sense of distance from the original composition is closed. A more dramatic version of the same conceit introduces a collection of treatises from Admont by Hugues and Victor, among them De Arche Noah, which opens Cum sederem aliquando in conventu, when I was one day sitting in the convent, a phrase alluded to by the unusual architectural form of the throne on which he sits. In the absence of a writing desk, the page on which Hugh writes becomes one with that of the manuscript itself. Medieval artists had myriad ways to draw the distinction between the living word and the dead letter on the page, even as by necessity they sought to invest writing with the authenticity of speech. The distinction was clearly drawn in depictions of heretics in debate with authorities, a kind of author-anti-author image. In a page of Augustine's Contra Faustum Manichaeum, whereas Augustine speaks, his words made voluble by his gestures, Faustus points to a book. A second initial opens chapter 22 with the words, Faustus said, you ask why we blaspheme the law and the prophets. Faustus perches on the lower crossbar of the letter. Below him, as if signaling confusion, a second figure is ensnared in its stem. The scroll he holds in his hand, signifying speech, might seem to represent an exception to the rule. When one looks at what it says, however, it is Augustine's question, not Faustus's reply. An anthology of works by Jerome, Augustine, and Ambrose from Mont Saint-Michel draws the same distinction. A full-page miniature prefaces a tract against the Donatist bishop Felicianus of Musti. In this case, Felicianus argues from the book to which he points with his right hand. It might be countered that Augustine also has a book, the Bejeweled Gospels, that rests on his lap, which he blesses with his left hand. The Gospel book, however, serves to identify his speech with that of Christ in the arcade surmounting the scene, who, like him, also makes a gesture of blessing. Augustine is like Christ in that he speaks gospel truth. Despite exemplifying an unapologetic logocentrism, author portraits of the High Middle Ages betray an underlying anxiety about the authority of written testimony. An initial introducing John's Gospel in the 3rd volume of the Ranshofen Bible introduces the in principio of John with a zoanthropomorphic initial, thereby lending startling embodiment to the evangelist's pregnant pronouncement. The figure's unnatural appearance, half man, half beast, underscores his status as a mediator between two worlds, as well as two media, the verbal and the visual. The words in display capitals proceed from the eagle's open beak. For good measure, adding the tactile to the vocal, it points not with his index finger, but with an extended talon to the P that opens the second line, touching it with the tip as if it could be penetrated. In keeping with the angel's injunction to John, take the book and eat it up, the letter becomes an object of prey, something to be ruminated upon, if not devoured. The scripts that open the text adhere to a clear hierarchy, whereas the first two lines employ epigraphic capitals emulating Roman monumental inscriptions. The line below them resorts to rustic capitals before proceeding in what follows in a more compressed late Carolingian minuscule. Through strategic spacing, the third line reads simply verbum et verbum, no accident, verbum, not scriptum, the spoken word. A composite manuscript from Saint-Evroult in Normandy offers another zoanthropomorphic portrait, in this case of Luke with the head of an ox. The initial, however, differs from that in the Ranshofen Bible. Rather than simply speaking his gospel, Luke displays it in the form of an open book, which mirrors the codex within which it is inscribed and painted. The image thus acquires a self-reflexive character, reinforcing the illusion of unbroken transmission, first from God to the inspired evangelist, and then from the evangelist to the reader. Ethereal inspiration, vested in the voice of the deity, takes on material form, but figurations of script and image, a distinction without a difference in many illuminated manuscripts, create the illusion that the book can speak, not only for the author, but for his ultimate source of authority. In the same manuscript, the initial opening, the Liber Pontificalis, employs the two compartments of a large capital B to act out the transmission of the text. At top, Jerome composes his letter to Pope Damasus and conveys it to a messenger. Jerome writes on what appears to be a codex, or more likely, a pair of tablets. Above the letter, an inscription reads, Jerome hands over what he has written to his faithful servant. In the lower compartment, Damasus in turn receives the letter. The inscription reads, Pope Damasus, rejoicing, accepts the letter from his esteemed Jerome. The initial traces the transfer of Jerome's spoken word through one or more intermediaries into the hands of the reader. In effect, the initial enacts a process of reception in which author and audience no longer communicate face-to-face, but rather through the book as go-between. In this case, the biting beasts whose entangled bodies constitute the form of the letter are the ones who lend it tangible, even edible form. Reading is rumination. It provides spiritual nourishment. The projection of presence constitutes the purpose of the preamble to the letter written by the Emperor Gratian to Ambrose, whose selected epistles form part of a collection of the saint's works in another manuscript from the same monastery. The emperor occupies a large A that introduces the name, not of Augustus, but rather that of the church father. The emperor's letter begins, "Great is my desire that as I remember you, though far away, and in spirit am present with you, so I may be with you in bodily presence also." Despite the salutation's invocation of what has been called the present absent topos, it would be hard to imagine a more succinct visualization of its content than the accompanying initial. In a manner that would have been considered déclassé, the emperor serves as his own amanuensis, holding not a staff, but rather a stylus, with a clearly defined blunt end for erasure, with which to jot down his intimate thoughts on a hinged pair of wax tablets. The emperor's longing to see an absent friend explains the presence at the apex of the letter of two figures, both with halos, who embrace with a chaste kiss. While diametrically opposed in expressing harmony rather than conflict, their configuration recalls the common motif of wrestlers locking arms, whether Jacob and the angel or other unidentified combatants. The paired motifs mark two sides of a single capital known as the Discord capital from Saint-Hilaire in Poitiers. And I'll confess that this morning I got the latest version of Gesta, which has an article which I've yet to read on this very capital, which shows on its front face two men pulling each other's beards with one hand while raising weapons with the other. And on its left side, two others, or possibly the same, embracing with their heads slumped on each other's shoulders. The themes of love, friendship, and rulership carry over to the next initial overleaf, no less ambitious than the first. It introduces Ambrose's treatise on faith addressed to the same emperor, in which his preliminary discourse refers to the Queen of Sheba coming to hear the wisdom of Solomon, the subject of the initial. Likewise, King Hiram sent to Solomon that he might prove him. So also your sacred majesty, following these examples of old time, has decreed to hear my confession of faith. Four listening figures, some of whom mimic the queen in raising their wine goblets, constitute portions of the letter R for Regina, which intersects the text in a consummate integration of word and image. Chains of transmission from author to reader, of which books were a part, but from which they, through their illustrations, seek to disappear, to create the illusion that the author, like Gratian, could speak directly to the recipient across time and space, themselves represent a common subject of miniatures. A set of Augustine's works in 4 volumes divided into 8 parts, written by the monks at the Premonstratensian Abbey of Notre-Dame at Belleval, Bois des Dames in the Ardennes, offers examples whose inventiveness surpasses their rather rustic execution. The volume containing Augustine's tractates on John is itself divided into 2 parts. In the second of these, following an added table of contents, the scribe, Hugo, filled the gap between the 2 sermons by linking the innermost text columns spanning an opening. At lower left, in the space left unfilled following the explicit of Tractate 36, Hugo placed a miniature of Christ holding a shepherd's crook, accompanied by the 12 apostles divided into 3 groups of 4. Christ points up and across the opening to the standing figure of Augustine, perched above the large initial D that opens Tractate 44. Augustine, who wears a satchel over his shoulder, also holds a crook, in his case that of a bishop, making him a mirror image of Christ. The conceit of the mirror image structures an initial introducing another part of this collection, a selection of Augustine's epistles, of which the first to be included, to Jerome, addresses the translation and interpretation of a passage in Galatians of critical importance in Augustine's polemic against the Manichees and Donatists. Like the other images in the set, the initial combines ingenious conceptualization and amateurist execution. In a variation on the inhabited vine scroll, 2 compartments defined by encircling foliage comprise the body of the initial I that introduces Jerome as the letter's addressee. The upper compartment portrays Christ in majesty. The same figure upside down, reversed, and critically bust length and drained of color appears in the lower compartment as if reflected, to illustrate the idea, a touchstone in Trinitarian theology, expressed in Paul's epistles to the Colossians that, quote, the Son is the image of the invisible God. Just as the scriptural passage distinguishes between substance and figuration, so too the initial differentiates between full color and line drawing. Augustine's De Trinitate was the authoritative work on the subject, but his letter to Jerome makes no mention of the subject. Its focus, rather, is translation. In fact, De Trinitate is not even among the works included in this very large set. Why then, one must ask, this curious representation of the Son as the mirror image of the Father? The answer lies in a variation on the rhetorical conceit that informed the opening of Gratian's letter to Ambrose. The initial depicts God the Father and Christ the Son, yet by way of analogy, it also depicts the two church fathers, one the mirror image of the other, just as Alypius is of one mind and body with Augustine. Sorry. As might be expected, the first volume in the set opens with an ambitious frontispiece. Within a 6-square frame determined by the 2-column format, crowned by a double architectural gable that unites text and image within a single, if subdivided space, 4 figures appear. In the top row, from left to right, the eagle of John, holding an oversized scroll, which the talons of his left claw have punctured. It's a wonderful detail. And Augustine as the Bishop of Hippo, identified by mitre, crozier, chasuble, and stole. And in the second row, 2 scribes, both with halos. The third row contains a poem in praise of Augustine. Text and image constitute a formal unity. The miniature has been described as Augustine pointing to John's symbols and 2 copyists writing on tablets. Augustine is blessing, not pointing, but why 2 copyists rather than just 1? More than a single scribe can take dictation. In the collection of Gregory's letters from Citeaux, the reader, having taken the place of the scribe, who according to the legend had spied on the saint, sees through the drawn curtain at whose ends sit 2 diminutive assistants. The frame constructs the reader as an eyewitness to the event. In the manuscript from Belval, another question presents itself. Why is one of the scribes, that on the right, bearded, and the other one tonsured but beardless? The composition is chiastic in character, as indicated by the coloration of the background. Blank parchment for the eagle at the upper left and the scribe at the lower right, who can be identified as John the Evangelist and thus appropriately paired with his symbol from whom he takes inspiration. And oxidized silver for Augustine at upper right and his amanuensis at lower left. Confirming the chiastic organization is that of the poem placed below the 4 figures, Leonine verses in praise of the saint, in which brown and red ink distinguish successive crossing couplets sharing the same endings, written in capitals at the right side of each column. Just as John was inspired by the eagle, so too, the miniature argues, was Augustine's amanuensis, and by extension, Hugo, the scribe of this copy, by the saint himself. A subsequent initial in the same volume condenses the argument further. The eagle and the evangelist perched atop a cactus-like outcrop and combined into a single zoomorphomorphic figure, right at the upper end of a 2-part scroll, whereas the saint, serving as his own scribe, initiates the inscription at the other end with the words, "Here Augustine pursues the sacred word of the eagle. He rises up to show the secure secret of the word." In keeping with the doubling of the scroll, which is also written in 2 colors, blue and red, the inscription defines a dialogue between inspired author and inspiring evangelist. At the upper left, the profile of a fool-like face with multiple tongues taking the form of foliage possibly represents or suggests the heretics and schismatics invoked in the poem on the facing page, who seek to interrupt the saint's flow of thought. Hugo's elevation of John continues in another initial in which the body of the standing saint introduces the section of his 18th tractate on, a section of his 18th tractate on the Gospel of John. Augustine articulates the doctrine of his deification, which was predicated on the visionary evangelist's unparalleled understanding of the secrets of the Godhead, to which Hugo had alluded in the speech scroll in the initial at the beginning of the manuscript. Here he does so in a different manner. Holding his gospel in his left hand, John points to it with his right. In this case, however, the word that comes at the beginning is not the word, but rather the John's own name, of which the initial constitutes the first letter. Let's see that right here. In the beginning was John the Evangelist. One could hardly ask for a clearer indication of John's unity with the Godhead. His word and God's word are one. A similar complexity informs the dedication page prefacing Augustine's Confessions from Saint-Vaast. At top left, Christ, seated on a sella curulis, appears from behind a curtain, blessing the author with his right hand and gesturing toward him with his left. Augustine, his work on the podium behind him, prostrates himself before Christ. Like the other human figures on the page, the author occupies a church, in this case identified by the small cross atop the pediment. In acknowledging Augustine and his work, Christ assures the reader of its divine sanction. In the lower register, the sequence of scenes runs in the opposite direction. At the right, Alardus, one of the four scribes who contributed to the volume, and who on the facing folio inserted hexameters petitioning Saint-Vaast, between Augustine's retraction regarding the Confessions and the rubric introducing the first book, speaks his verses, hence the long scroll rather than the codex itself. And he speaks these to the saint, sometimes identified as Bishop of Arras and Cambrai, hence his attributes. Just as Vadast's pose echoes that of Christ above him, so too Alardus's mirrors that of Augustine. As in the manuscript from Belval, the scribe lays claims to some of the privileges of authorship in ways that elevate his station or underwrite his poetic petition for salvation and underpin the authenticity of the words he has penned, which, like Augustine's original composition, received approval from on high. Alardus was hardly the only scribe at Saint-Vaast who, in broadcasting his humility, simultaneously managed to amplify his own status. The monastery's manuscript of Jerome's commentary on the Psalms portrays the patron saint in the mirror of the scribe, the essential difference, aside from scale, being that the scribe, who signs himself Rudolph, sits outside the heavenly zone. Filling the verso of the open book within which he writes is the opening of the first psalm, anticipating the incipit overleaf. A powerful cloudburst, like waves breaking on a beach, displaces the saint's throne to the right, where it transgresses the arc, demarcating heaven from earth. One would expect the saint to speak and the scribe to take dictation. Yet the artist has gone to great lengths to show that pen in hand, the saint, in fact, is writing. No letters appear on his scroll, which is so long that one end is supported by a sprig of foliage. The small green marks arrayed in rows running from side to side leave no mistake that he, too, is a scribe. The accompanying poem gives a hint as to what the many marks designate. It reads in part, "As I write the book, Vadast looks down from the uppermost region, from heaven, and notes how many letters I trace with my pens, and how many lines furrow the page, and with how many sharp points the folio is wounded on this side and that," adding, "As many are the letters, as many are the lines, and finally, as many are the prickings in this book, so many sins I now remit for you." The saintly stenographer makes a record of Rudolph's iniquities. Light can also link a book made by human hands to its divine origins. In the two-volume Bible from the Premonstratensian Abbey of St. Mary and Nicholas at Arnstein an der Lahn, written by the monk Lunandus around 1172, of the portraits, that for John is predictably the most magnificent. In an array in which it is impossible to disentangle text from image, John, the visionary evangelist, receives the word of God from Christ, whose hand suspends a golden codex above John's head. Just as his hand is the only part of his body that penetrates the space of the in principio itself, so too his halo is the only element that transgresses the frame. John's eagle, acting as intermediary, touches its beak to John's lip as if to purge them on the model of the prophet Ezekiel. Even John's contorted pose refers to his inspiration. As if to embody the fiat lux of Genesis, the light of the Logos, embodied by the Golden Book, floods the remainder of the page, whose burnished gold effectively fills the folio with radiance to give material incarnation to John's words, "The light shineth in darkness." Thus far, I have only discussed manuscripts of venerable authors, if not evangelists, then church fathers. When it came to the Moderni, there was considerable hesitation to grant more recent, let alone living authors, a dignity that had, for the most part, been reserved for saints. Only in the 12th century can one remark a change in attitude that coincides with the new prominence, first of vernaculars as literary languages in their own right, second, the proliferation of commentaries, whether on the Bible or the Fathers, by living authors, usually in the context of the schools and the university in Paris, and third, what might be called, if not a democratization of the privileges of authorship, portraits being one of them, then the beginnings of a process of desacralization that in time would sever the link between the author and the book as a vessel of sacred speech. Another way of putting this might be to say that despite appearances, the inspired authors of the earlier Middle Ages were not really authors at all, at least not in the modern sense. Rather than sources of inspiration, they served as conduits for a sacred message. A two-page spread from a 12th century Bavarian homilary makes the point in visual terms. The image on the recto of Gregory the Great, surrounded not by scribes, but as indicated by their halos for other saintly authors, replicates that of the Christ in Majesty with the four evangelists on the verso, the principal difference being that whereas Christ and company are enclosed in circles or an ellipse, Gregory and his companions nest within diamond-shaped lozenges. The distinction drawn by the facing miniatures resembles that between circular and square halos. The facing miniatures, which touch when the book is closed, portray the fathers, if not as perfect reincarnations of Christ and the evangelists, then as mirrors in which their images are reflected. Their Christomimesis, however, diminishes their own independent status. Rather than originals, they are copies. It is against this background that a novel generation of contemporary author portraits arises over the course of the 12th century. The small letter C within which Peter Lombard writes not his text, but rather his initials, MLP, or Magister Lombardus Parisiensis, prior to the prologue to his sentences in a Parisian manuscript that likely can be dated shortly before his death in 1160, may seem unassuming, but it is actually quite daring in its assertion of authorial presence. The person is no longer portrayed as a saint, but rather a scholar, and his text is identical with his person. Presaging the emergence of modern masters as authors worthy of representation are portraits of post-patristic authors, such as Paschasius Radbertus. The Carolingian abbot of Quimby, celebrated for having laid the groundwork for what became the doctrine of transubstantiation, appears in a full-page image in the manner of an evangelist. The transfer of authority represents a meaningful choice. The words Paschasius writes, Dilectissimo Filio, echo those found in the canon of the Mass. They provide a fitting complement to his treatise on the Eucharist. In a 13th century manuscript of the Flores Bernardi, the Cistercian, who had been canonized in 1174, is shown not as a saint, but simply as a teacher. A contemporary French copy of the compilation departs further from convention in that in lieu of the saint, it portrays an Augustinian canon who can be identified as the compiler. Identified by an inscription as Master William of Courtrai, He props himself up in bed, surrounded by the books on which he draws, and recording the excerpts on a set of wax tablets in his hands. An additional cushion for his comfort lies just beneath the inscription. Identified as a cleric by his frock and tonsure, William was a canon of the Collegiate Church of Notre Dame in Parkway from 1226 to 1234. His boots and the cloak draped above the bed further identify him as an itinerant. The depiction of him in bed surrounded by books provides the perfect match to Chaucer's description of the clerk, who would rather have at his bed's head some 20 books, all bound in black or red, of Aristotle and his philosophy than rich robes, fiddle, or gay psaltery. The miniature of William is surprising in several respects. First, it confers on a compiler a portrait of a kind usually reserved for an author. Later in the century, Bonaventure distinguished between the two roles as part of a fourfold differentiation among scribe, compiler, commentator, and author. Whereas a scribe merely copies, neither adding nor changing anything, so he says, the compiler rearranges texts that he did not compose. The commentator in turn supplements another's text, whereas an author produces work that is essentially his own. Still more startling, however, is the way William is depicted. In a redefinition of otio, lectio, and scriptio, all have become leisure, an activity to be enjoyed in bed, attested as early as the 12th century. In Guibert de Nogent's so-called autobiography, De Vita Sua, the monk relates that when he was a student, quote, "How often they thought I was asleep and resting my little body under the coverlet when my mind was really concentrated on composition, or I was reading under a blanket, fearful of the rebuke of others." William's portrayal invites comparison with that of the crowned Adonais Leroy performing, in keeping with his sobriquet, as the king of minstrels at the bedside of Marie de Brabant, the Queen of France, at the head of a poetic miscellany, which opens with his Cleomades, a work the Queen had commissioned. Marie is joined by her nephew, the future John II of Brabant, and Blanche of Castile, her sister-in-law, and the daughter of Saint Louis. Not only a symbol of leisure, by the High Middle Ages, the bed had become a sign of status and a locus of interiority. No less contemporary in the context of their time are portraits of composers of liturgical chant who enjoyed special status. A miniature in the Troper Sequentiary, written at St. Gall, a leading center for the composition of sequences, portrays Notker Babulus composing the sequence for Pentecost, Sancti Spiritus Acit Nobis Gratia. An inventory describes the manuscript's lost ivory cover as having depicted Marcellus, Iso, Notker, and his brother Othar, all authors of sequences at the monastery. Guido of Arezzo, the music theorist credited with inventing modern staff notation and psalmization, also enjoyed the privilege of portraiture. In a collection of musical treatises copied at St. Ulrich and Afra in Augsburg, only a generation or two after his death, his portrait joins that of Gregory the Great within a series of prefatory images that further includes a depiction of the forging of the 5 hammers of Pythagoras, an author portrait of Pythagoras, and a personification of music. A comparable collection portrays Guido at the beginning of his hugely influential Micrologus, instructing Bishop Tedald of Arezzo, his patron, on the monochord. In concert with ancient authorities, the author as didact now accompanies the reader, lending a helping hand. Joining Guido is a treatise, The Dialogue on Music by Pseudo Odo of Cluny, who designated here as Otto appears in more traditional authorial guise. Most unusual, however, is the portrait of Boethius as the author of De Musica, the only treatise to have surpassed Guido's in influence, in which his placement within a double mandorla of a kind usually reserved for Christ in majesty effectively deifies him. Extraordinary, but not exceptional, predicated on the doctrine of deification espoused in the Consolation of Philosophy, other 12th century portraits of Boethius in Christomimetic guise exist. A theological principle becomes a pattern of visualization. Not only did new authors join the canon, old authors took on new guises. At the opening of a miscellany of passages from classical authors in a florilegium of uncertain origin, probably northeastern France around 1200, Homer adopts the form of a Greek Christ Pantocrator. A South German manuscript of Virgil, also dated around 1200, endows the poet with trappings of an inspired evangelist, adding only a laurel crown. It would be too simple to say that in concocting these images, the illuminators had no choice but to fall back on familiar formulas. Rather, models are chosen to invest a more diverse array of authors with the dignity previously reserved for vessels of the sacred. A manuscript of the Dragmaticon, a work of Neoplatonic cosmology by William of Conches, moves us squarely into the realm of secular literature. In the miniature's upper register, Lady Philosophy converses with Plato. Zigzag scrolls animate their dialogue. Philosophy declares, if anyone chooses wisdom, decline to me and discover it. And any art without me is not worth nor able to teach anything. To which Plato replies, philosophy is the assiduous meditation on death. In the lower register, Geoffrey of Anjou, Duke of Normandy and William's protector, conducts an exchange with the philosopher. Geoffrey asks, first of all, I would like to ask you, what is substance? To which William replies, a thing that exists in itself is named substance. The image is extraordinary for its placing of William, if not on par with Plato, then parallel with him, and its presentation of Geoffrey as a sophisticated ruler presiding over something akin to a courtly salon. No less important, however, the miniature opens the book in the direction of conversation, or more accurately, dialogue and dispute. Rather than simply submitting to the authority of the author, the reader is now invited to join in an exchange, in effect to talk back. A similar intention informs the frontispiece to a collection of Augustine's works from the Benedictine Abbey of St. Georg near Regensburg. The drawing shows the saint teaching 3 students. Frontispieces such as this anticipate the representations of pedagogy that pepper 13th century school books. Examples include a late 13th century exemplar of the Magnae Derivationes by Huguzio of Pisa, in which the canonist instructs a circle of students, each of whom clutches their own codex. Representations of dialogue can be traced back to antiquity, but they enjoyed newfound popularity in the 12th and 13th centuries, the high watermark of the scholastic disputation. The representation of authors during this period reflects this change in the culture of authority. Paired full-page author portraits prefacing a miscellany written for Rugger II, abbot of Frauenburg at Fulda, exploit an opening to dramatize an exchange between Emperor Theodosius and Cassiodorus. The portraits preface a miscellany including a history of the monastery, excerpts from Cassiodorus, Hugh and Victor's Didascalicon, and several treatises on the Old Testament. A third author portrait depicts Hugh. He holds the Didascalicon, which opens with the words, of all things to be sought, the first is that wisdom in which the form is wisdom in which the form stands fixed. Although depicting according to the formula traditionally reserved for evangelists, he has no halo. Rather, he's identified by an inscription and display capitals as Magister Hugo. Like the miscellany itself, the trio of portraits sets the authors in conversation with one another, intermingling ancient and contemporary voices. The moderni rival the antiqui. Oops, sorry. The portraits of the emperor and his secretary do more, however, than simply identify the contents of the volume. While Theodoric originally dictated his letters and edicts, hence the scroll he holds in his hands, Cassiodorus revised them after his retirement to Vivarium, hence his book, of which he is the author. The words that each of them speak clarify the nature of the transaction between them. Both statements derive from the same letter in which they elaborate a metaphor comparing a quarrelsome person who refuses to bring a lawsuit to an end to a patient who refuses treatment. For one who would reject being peaceful on his own, on account of his own vices, ought to be compelled to be peaceful. Even so does the skilled doctor often cure the uncooperative patient, where the will is unbalanced by burdensome desires, so that the patient grasps after that which is onerous rather than that which is perceived to be a healthful choice. Out of context, however, the passage's meaning is transformed. In an inversion of the historical situation that generated the letter in the first place, Cassiodorus speaks truth to power, telling the emperor to mend his ways. The metaphor's vehicle becomes its tenor. With what might be considered a chutzpah, Cassiodorus tells the emperor, for one who would reject being peaceful on account of his own vices ought to be compelled to be peaceful, suggesting that the subject of the conversation is not an unending lawsuit, but rather the ruler's ethics. The emperor responds, even so does the skilled doctor often cure the uncooperative patient, thereby identifying Cassiodorus as the physician and himself as the one who requires remedy. In light of the Abbey of Fulda's tempestuous relationship with Emperor Henry IV during the investiture crisis, as well as in negotiating its end through the Concordat of Worms, to which Abbot Erlof was a major contributor, the Abbey's attitude towards emperors would have been anything but neutral. Henry IV's confiscation of a significant portion of the Abbey's property, which had reduced it to poverty, and its restoration by his successor, Henry V, in 1123, would have remained in living memory at the time the manuscript was made. As depicted in its opening pages, the sovereign shows himself to be a willing student. The secular subjects itself to the ecclesiastical. The paired images are cleverly constructed in ways that themselves constitute a commentary on the relationship of speaking to writing. They can be read in either direction, on the one hand from left to right or vice versa. Scanned from verso to recto, Theodoric dictates his letter, which Cassiodorus transcribes. Read in reverse, however, Cassiodorus addresses the emperor, reading from his book, entirely in keeping with one sense of the term lectio as defined by Hugh of St. Victor, which forms part of the same volume. Reading is of three types, he says, the teachers, the learners, and the independent readers. For we say, I am reading the book to him, I am reading the book under him, and I am reading the book. As portrayed in the image, Cassiodorus appears to follow his prescription in the institutiones that scribes preach with their fingers, that is, by copying scripture, and by extension, other edifying works. According to this formulation, all writing speaks through the agency of the scribe. It is as if the author of the work were present, viva voce, an avatar indeed. This is my last image. Still more dramatic in its construction of dialogue is another opening consisting of two in a series of 4 full-page drawings prefacing Augustine's City of God in a copy from Canterbury. The earliest extant post-conquest English manuscript to include full-page miniatures, the Codex makes its author portrait into a programmatic statement of reform in the spirit of Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury. Portrayed in a combination of frontile and profile views, Augustine appears not only as author, but also as teacher, pointing to his book, the one he holds in his hands, but also by proxy, the one held by the reader in his, as do the figures in the ediculas below him, all identified as monks by their tonsures. In contrast, those occupying the two registers on the facing folio are the philosophers with whom the church father conducts a disputation, an appropriate subject at the head of De Civitate Dei, of which the 19th chapter consists of a rebuttal of their views. In effect, the opening articulates the opposition between the city of God and the earthly city. In keeping with the genre to which it belongs, the author portrait, but of which it represents an especially elaborate example, the representation of Augustine disputing the philosophers possesses a self-referential character. In this case, it too is especially well developed. The image inserts the book into the context of debate and discussion, activating its use and precipitating the reader's participation. The philosophers join in this process. They hold tablets, books, and scrolls, a range of media that itself suggests the passage from speech to written record. The entire recto appears as if it had been brought into being by the gesture of the saint's right hand, consisting of an extended index finger pointing across the opening, a gesture reciprocated by the bearded man at upper left, as well as his counterpart at lower right, whose hand holding a book is the one element to transgress the frame. Filling the frame are medallions of still other auditors. To the image of the author is joined another of his audience, as if in a visualized sic et non, with each receiving equal weight. If not unprecedented, Christ, after all, often appears preaching to his disciples, the opening innovates in anticipating and enacting its own reception. To judge from the image, the audience is alert, alive, and animated by what it hears, or by what, to return to where I began, the image would have the reader when he turns from an author portrait to the text proper, experiences as if he had heard rather than simply read it. It's in the spirit of this amazing image that I look forward to your questions. Whether, like Augustine, I have converted anyone, I leave to you to decide.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. We do have a little bit of time for questions. We ask that, well, there may be questions from the chat on Zoom, and for questions in the room that you come up and speak into this device here. Into here, yeah, or they can be repeated if they're sure. We also have a microphone. Oh, we also have a microphone. That will only get to the room. Right. Okay. I have a first question, maybe just to start. With these extraordinary examples, the way the text is written in the books as displayed can vary, and sometimes it seems to be in the same by the same hand as the illuminator or illustrator. Sometimes it seems to be distinct. Have you sort of noticed any kind of patterns in that?
Yes, it's complicated, of course, because to answer the question with regard to any single codex would require parsing it paleographically, which I have not had a chance to do with these examples. But I think in general, the rule holds that the farther you go back in time, at least in the post-Carolingian period, the greater the likelihood that scribe and illuminator can be the same person. I mean, obviously, in many cases, that's not true. But certainly by the later 12th century, with the professionalization of the book trade, it's the exception rather than the rule, and those exceptions therefore become exceptionally interesting. The writing in the books would be a whole lecture in itself. But I think that the words are very carefully chosen. Sometimes it's simply like a label, a tag, so you know, the in principio, okay, so you know it's the Gospel of John and so on and so forth. But in other cases, they carry a more loaded meaning. I think that one example I showed of John holding the in principio, but the I is the I of Johannes, as opposed to the beginning of Genesis, is a particularly nice example.
I'd like to get this work. Right there.
I'm not sure, but maybe.
Okay. So, thank you so much for wonderful talk. It's fascinating. So the order in which you showed as your slide, sort of creating a progression from God giving a message to someone to the author giving a message to the reader. So if we have in the beginning, the scroll comes in as it ended, but now in this last slide, we have the interactive monk, the column debating, and all the people witness. So we have like 4 levels.
Right.
Is that something that changes over time, meaning with the girls' university or cathedral school, or is it like temporal progression from earlier manuscripts that just have God's evangelist and later manuscripts that focus to students? Is that like a chronological progression, or is it like how you order your things in your thoughts?
I think it again, to generalize, which is always a risky thing to do. I think that on the whole, it is a progression.
Yeah.
So we have many images from the late Middle Ages that show scholars at work in their studies, or you think of all of those paintings of humanists at work in their studio, though. So in general, I think that it is a progression, but it's also, as you suggest, a typology. And there are representations of dialogue going back to the early Christian period. Sometimes you see prophets and apostles in dialogue in a kind of dispute. But I think an image like this does reflect the new atmosphere of the schools. This is very much the atmosphere in which people are wandering around France to go sit at the feet of a famous master, just as all of these monks here are at the feet of Augustine. So I think, without putting it too crudely, that changes in the author portrait reflect broader changes in the culture of authority within book culture and the culture of pedagogy. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
And then, of course, with the introduction of vernacular literature, it's very interesting to see how vernacular authors are treated. I'll confess that in my book, which Nick kindly plugged, and in this lecture also, I've emphasized the Latin authors and the earlier to high Middle Ages, because there is a huge literature, as you probably know, on the representation of authorship, but it's almost exclusively devoted to authors of vernacular literature, which is very interesting and very important. But one reason why the topic caught my attention is because, you know, since Alfred Friend wrote his landmark article on evangelist portraits, it's as if, I mean, there are obviously some good things that have been written on evangelist portraits, but nothing that really tries to embrace the sheer quantity and quality of material before the vernaculars become so important. So I still think there's just a massive material to be uncovered and investigated. There's a question over here on the left, and I think there was one here on the right too.
Maybe you just get the. Is there, where was the second?
You can use the microphone.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this wonderful lecture. My background is that I do ancient Greek and medieval music, so my question actually comes to that. You show several pages of the, I think the Codex something 51. So you show several pages about from the Hamburg Pythagoras, Boethius to the Ordo Vico, and so I'm very interested about this manuscript because it doesn't look like something religious, let's say it. It doesn't look like a music theory, nor is it not something like introducing the liberal arts. So I just wonder that is there any comments about this manuscript, and also is this a single case of it, or you have other examples that have similar comments? Thank you.
Yes, it's not the only example. There are at least two others that have similar contents and in part the same program of illustration. And it's really just an hypothesis on my part, but I find it interesting that one of the first areas in which one finds a new set of author portraits appearing is in the realm of composers of sacred music. So there is a religious context. These are all composers of sacred music. But this is one of the very first groups of, this is an amazing image, I think. This is a manuscript formerly in Berlin, but that now, as an example of what the Germans would call Beutekunst, is kept in the Jagiellonian Library in Krakow. There is this group of images of authors of sacred music. So you see an expansion of the canon to include especially authors of sequences, these chants sung after the Alleluia, hence their name sequence, in the Mass ceremony. But these manuscripts, as far as I have been able to determine, they don't contain chant themselves. They're treatises on music.
And we have one more question. Oh, David, or maybe get the microphone home.
I don't want to delay the party, but so thank you. So this is such a really talk. I was listening to two questions. I was so struck by your remark about the analysis of investigating these evangelist portraits. So could you maybe speculate why the field has somehow either repressed or suppressed critical inquiry upon it? Is this something that's subconscious?
Well, I think suppressed may be a little strong because there are many studies of individual manuscripts that explore, let's say, of gospel books that explore the depiction of the evangelists in that particular book in great depth, also for Byzantine gospel books. But I don't think, given how important that genre was in the early and high Middle Ages, that there's been sufficient attention to the genre, if I can put it that way, as such in a more global sense. I can think back, there was a wonderful article by Carl Nordenfalk on the inspired evangelist that took a broader purview. So there are examples. I just don't think that the quantity of scholarship is adequate to the richness and quantity of the material.
So it's nothing to do with some type of
No, in this case, I don't think there's an ideological agenda. Sorry.
The second question I have is for the various probes pattern you laid out, could we actually then extend them or apply them to images of silent contemplation in which you have, let's say, averbal, non-verbal existing. So is there, I mean, can you actually speculate on what does it mean to pick someone who is actually completely silent and yet contemplate?
No, that's an interesting question, and my mind turns immediately to representations, say, of the stigmatization of St. Francis, and other contexts and other ways of indicating someone being suffused with the sacred. I look forward to your lecture on that.
I feel like that's actually done.
I think with that, we should close tonight's proceedings and thank Dr. Hamburger for this wonderful talk. And we look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow morning at the Kislak Center at Penn, where we'll kick off the first full day of the symposium proceedings. Thank you.